Hi everyone, and welcome to today's session. My name is Kate McGough. I am the Head of Portfolios for Primary at Nelson Cengage, and this is my colleague Jessica Norde, who is our Associate Marketing Manager for Primary as well. And we also have Susanna on the line too, who is another Marketing Manager as well. And I'm here to introduce our speaker today. So welcome to those of you who attended our session last week on why prose reading matters more than ever, which was a fantastic session. And we welcome back Dr. Nathaniel Swain. Dr. Nathaniel Swain is a teacher, instructional coach and writer. He's passionate about language literacy and learning, and he's an advocate for effective and engaging teaching for all students. Nathaniel is a sought-after speaker on educational circuits and has a best-selling book entitled Harnessing the Science of Learning. And he works with schools and organisations on classroom practice and school improvement. And we're right on 4 o'clock, so I'm going to hand over to you, Nathaniel, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you everyone for joining. It's a privilege to be with you, and I thank you as well for tuning in after what must be a pretty busy school day at a busy part of the term. But this is a topic that is really close to my heart, so you could ask me to do this at any time in the year, and I would definitely jump at the opportunity. Knowledge, I think, is a really interesting topic to talk about because in this day and age, it may seem like less of an important thing, given the fact that you can use things like ChatGPT. We've always been able to use the internet in the last 20 years or so, but you can use these tools basically to answer any question that you might have. So you might wonder whether knowledge is necessary or not. What's so interesting about the research that I'm passionate about around reading comprehension, but also around learning in general, is that knowledge does power all future and past learning. So when students have knowledge at their fingertips, they can do things, and they can see things, they can interpret things that previously were not actually interpretable. It's wonderful to have so many of you here. So if you do want to say hello in the chat, you're most than welcome, more than welcome to, and some people have started doing that already. And if you have questions throughout the session as well, you can also put them into the chat. And if necessary, the team will sort of interrupt and allow me to answer some of those questions in real time. Otherwise, there might be about 10 minutes or so at the end of the session to answer some of those questions. In case you didn't join in last week, where we talked about the importance of prose and that sort of connected text for learning, one of the key messages that we had was that the text should really drive the rigor, not necessarily just the attempt to embed a strategy. And this is vital in this day and age because essentially we could get students to read any text in the time that we have with them, but what text they choose is incredibly important. We talked last time about the importance of challenge and how we don't want the text to necessarily be easy. We want them to be scaffolded so that they feel successful, but that increasingly we move towards things that are challenging. So why challenge our students? We actually talked about this last time because we want them to benefit from those learning experiences and to experience the stretch and the opportunity to go further with their learning that only written language actually affords. Remembering from last time that written language allows you to experience the kind of vocabulary, syntax, and background knowledge, as we'll talk about today, that is not usually spoken about in everyday conversation. And we looked at the importance of something like a bridging prose text in order to have richer vocabulary exposure, but something that you can do with students after they finish decodables, but before they're able to do a fully formed chapter book or novel, for example. So a bridging prose text we talked about last time is something that has complex syntax, contextual inferences, sustained attention needed, and preparation for academic texts in the future, but that is achievable for students who can't quite handle a fully fledged nonfiction or fiction text that they might be able to do later in their schooling. So it was really a great discussion. I really enjoyed talking to you about that. And then I started to hint at some of these big ideas within comprehension, and that's where we're going to pick up the thread today. We looked briefly at this slide as well around the trouble with comprehension, and the trouble with comprehension being that we work in a time when students are reading less than ever and may not have everything that they need to feel successful when reading challenging texts. So learners do struggle to focus for extended reading. They also might not be used to reading a lot of prose. They might have a lot of other kinds of reading in their diet, and refer back to that other presentation if you haven't seen it as to why I think that's a problem. And learners might not have strategies to grapple with complex text, something I introduced as a term last time as well, but which we'll pick up again today. Finally, learners may actually lack the decoding, the vocabulary, or the background knowledge for the text. And my pitch to you today is why that background knowledge is so vital, and how we can try and fill the gap. I'm going to look at the reading rope again today. I hope that's okay, because we picked it up at the end of last session, but I really want to ensure that everyone has that clear in their mind. But beforehand, I want to give you access to another model of comprehension, one that hasn't been so popularly sort of taken up by schools and by teachers and educators, which is called the situation or tripartite model. And one of the authors that is known for doing this is Van Dijk and Kinch, are both very popular authors that have been looking at this model for many years. This is not a new model. This is something from the 80s, which I'm highlighting here, but it's something that does help us answer a lot of the questions around why some students find it difficult to manage the kinds of text that we want to, and the importance of background knowledge. So let's look at this model from the start to beginning. It builds from the bottom, and as per the other presentation, you will, as a registrant, get a copy of the slides, and you can also look back at the recording of this. If you want to take a few notes, you can, but otherwise enjoy the show. So the reading basically starts with the text, and the first thing that students need to access is something called the surface code. And the surface code is the ability to decode the words and understand what the meanings of those individual words are. So decoding and basic vocabulary is a vital entry point to beginning the reading process. Not being able to read a particular word or not knowing the meaning of a particular word could throw off the understanding of an entire paragraph, if not an entire page. So the surface code is the beginning, and it includes both the decoding as well as the knowledge of the words and what they mean. Built upon the surface code, and this is a hierarchical model that sort of builds from one level to the next. One level is dependent on the other. The surface code gives way to what's called the text base. And the text base is our basic sentence understanding. The questions you might answer are, what is this text about? What is this text saying at a basic sentence level meaning? It's also the ability to carry some connection from one sentence to the next and look for something called cohesive devices. So to tell you a little bit more, we'll just pause this little diagram for a moment and look at the text base in more detail. It's about understanding the meaning of individual sentences, including their grammar, making sense of basic meanings of the text, including the points or propositions, and following the cohesion of text. So how sentences link together, including pronouns, as we've started to talk about. So pronouns like he, she, it, them, this, there, and then, and synonyms as well. So sometimes we use a word to stand in for something else. And at the text-based level, we need to keep track of who's doing what to whom. And some students really find this quite difficult. They might get confused with the pronouns as to who they're referring back to, or they might not realize that some synonyms are actually referring to the same thing, or you've got similar words that are referring to different things in the text. Let me show you an example. This is adapted from the York Assessment for Reading Comprehension and just has a little simple example of this. Carlyle and Rice talk about comprehension being the ability to understand individual sentences and link the ideas in a given sentence to ideas in the sentence that come before and after. And that's really what the text base is all about. So here's my little excerpt from this text about robins. We've got, the robin is a bird with a bright red face, neck, and breast. You can find it in gardens, parks, and woods all year round. It's really vital that students can carry the meaning of robin connected to it. And if they don't, this paragraph starts to fall apart. We might think that other things can be found in gardens, parks, or woods all year round. Again, we've got their nests here, and robins make their nest in a hole in a tree stump, bank, or wall. Sometimes they nest, and this they has to refer back to the robins and the fact that they're making nests. And this there obviously refers back to this original robin. Finally, you've also got some other theys and theirs here. We need to make sure we know that it's the robin each time, which is really important. I've got a harder example now. I've got some vocab words which are part of the surface code, which I'll look at first, and then we'll talk about the text base that's here as well. So this is also taken for the York Assessment for Reading Comprehension. It's an excerpt about female pirates or pirates at sea. And essentially, we've got some tricky vocab, which is not the text base, but is part of that surface code. If we look back here, I'll just highlight those first, and then I'll say how the sentence level meanings are found, so what the text base is. So here we go. One of the tricky words here are viciously, so doing something in a really sort of mean or antagonistic way. Fierce is another synonym for viciously, so fiercely. Periodically means sometimes or every now and then. Reprieve here is both women were captured and condemned to hang but received a reprieve, meaning that they didn't get hanged in the end. And then speculation, meaning here that it's not clear whether it's one thing or the next, and other people have some ideas and other people disagree. So I might actually read this paragraph out just so we've got that idea now that I've done a bit of vocab work with you, if you're my group of students, and then we can see after I read it where some of the connections to the text base, sentence level cohesion or confusion might come in. Less well remembered are female pirates such as Grace O'Malley, Mary Read, and Anne Bonny, who were all as bold as any of the men. Females at sea were once considered unlucky, so in the disguise of men, they fought as viciously as any of the gang. In 1720, Read and Bonny fought fearlessly to defend their ship from the British Navy, while their crew hid below deck. In fact, both women were so disgusted with the men's response that they periodically turned their own guns on them. Both women were captured and condemned to hang, but received a reprieve. Bonny's eventual fate remains a matter for speculation. So what I'm going to do now is show you all the links to the text base. So here we've got female pirates, and we have to know that the examples of those pirates are Grace O'Malley, Mary Read, and Anne Bonny. And if we lose that, we don't really know who these people are and what it's referring to. We also need to know that females at sea is a synonym for female pirates, and that they appear again in this pronoun they, and that's who we're talking about. We also need to know that Read and Bonny, again, are female pirates. It's their ship, it's both women, and it's their own guns. And these all refer back to the same people or their things. In contrast, we've got men here, and that should link back to the gang. So the gang being the men in the crew. Then it's their crew, which are the men, the men's response, which is them being cowardly, and them being the people who are getting the female pirates' guns turned on them so that they were about to be shot potentially. We've also got hid below deck. The synonym for that is response. And if we don't know what that means, we actually are a bit confused as to why the female pirates are shooting their own gang. We also need to know that captured and condemned to hang links to this idea of an eventual fate, where both women's fate was to get a reprieve, whereas Bonny's fate is a bit unclear. She might have been hanged, she might not have been, which is interesting. So that is the text base, and you can see that although we haven't gotten to any comprehension questions yet, this is actually quite complicated depending on the text. Something you can do to help students to make cohesion is to teach them about pronoun referencing and showing how one pronoun refers back or refers forward to other words, or how a synonym, like I was circling before, can mean the same thing. So if you're doing a text on earthquakes, they need to know that if we're saying earthquakes, natural disaster, and this tragedy, all relates back to that same concept. So circling earthquakes, linking it to disaster and tragedy to show that we're still talking about the same thing. Otherwise, they might think that there's some other problem or some other tragedy or some other natural disaster, such as a fire. And that is really important that that's not confused, or the next phase of the comprehension model is affected. So what do you use to build next based upon that text base? The text base gives rise to what we call the mental model. And the mental model is a representation of the text that exists just inside the student's mind, or the reader's mind, so to speak. So to answer the question, what do I remember about the text? We refer back to this mental model we've created. Sometimes this might be, a bit of a picture of what happened. It could be something that we're playing back, like a step-by-step process. But otherwise, it's a representation that is not quite a copy of the text because we can't copy it verbatim, but a sense of what happened, a sense of the characters, a sense of the main ideas, and what happened during the story. So the mental model is vital because this is what we get students to refer to when they answer comprehension questions. And that's really, really vital because Some students have a lot of difficulty building a mental model, and some breakdowns occur in this model. And if breakdowns occur in the surface code, decoding or understanding the meaning of words, or the text base, sentences not making sense, then the mental model can't be constructed properly. The mental model is essentially creating a representation of the world within the text. It's dependent on the comprehension of the surface code text base, as well as what we'll look at the last part of the model, background knowledge. It also feeds into students' own knowledge. So when students read a text well and they build a mental model, it actually builds their understanding, builds their knowledge, which is amazing. You can learn from what you read. And this is how we learn from what we read. The mental model is also readers having to ask themselves questions as they read. And this is one of the best ways that you can stimulate a better representation or mental model of the text. So you can say, what is this about? What's the main idea? What's the author saying? Why is the author saying this? Have I read something like this before? By creating a mental model, readers construct their own representation of what they've read, and it becomes a bit of a summary or a synthesis. And this is how we read for meaning, so to speak. Interestingly, if students haven't actually created a proper mental model, it's very obvious when you ask them a comprehension question, because after they've read it and they get the question, they essentially go back to start reading the text again from scratch. So they obviously don't have anything to refer to, so they're just beginning reading again. So one of the ways you can avoid this problem where they've read through but not understood and have to start reading again straight away is by getting them to pause and ask questions all the way through. And that's important because mental models don't always get created by themselves, especially if the student's not aware that they have missed something or that they've misunderstood or misinterpreted something important. So where does the mental model connect with? Is it in a vacuum? Is it just built from the below? Actually, as I hinted at before, it connects with the schema. And the schema is a representation of what we know about the topic or the big ideas within the text. There might be a text that has multiple topics that are connected to it. So to answer the question of the schema, we're answering what do I already know and what do I think about this topic or this idea or this piece of knowledge. What I've done here is represented the schema as a wardrobe, and this is by design. The reason being is that our schema or way of organizing, in this case, the metaphor is clothing, and these items of clothing, which could represent ideas from the text, have a structure or a place that they can go. If the students know something about it, if they have a schema for that topic that's being read about in the text, then they have somewhere to store all those interesting facts. They've got somewhere to sort. And you'll notice that some of these arrows are both ways, so there's a dual connection. So you can retrieve things from your schema to help you make sense of the text. And that's really the important idea here, that the schema isn't just a place to put stuff, it's a place to retrieve from. And that's where knowledge plays an important part, because the schema is a way of organizing all the knowledge that we have. And as I hinted at, we have a multitude, millions and millions of different schema on various topics and organized in interesting ways. So the why for prose text in terms of comprehension is that reading comprehension involves processing language at many different levels. And linking back to last week's presentation, we need students to read harder, more connected text so that they can go through all of these processes, not necessarily just using images or familiar content or dialogue to sort of carry their comprehension, but to have to piece it together themselves from the surface code all the way to the mental model and back again. So at the word level, the reader must decode individual words to access the meaning. At the sentence level, the comprehender needs to work out the syntactic structure, and simply deriving the meanings of individual words is insufficient. In order to construct a mental model, the comprehender needs to integrate information from different sentences to create what's called, fancy word, local coherence, and to then incorporate background knowledge and ideas which come from that schema to make sense of things that are sometimes only implicitly mentioned. So in terms of implicature, what authors do, they imply things and readers infer things. So writers always imply things, or they leave space for inferences. But as I'm hoping you're getting to see, if you don't have knowledge, if you don't have something in your schema, you can't actually make the inference. So inferencing is an interesting skill because you can teach it in principle, but you can't infer if you don't already have something in your background knowledge. If you don't have a schema for that, then you can't access it. And that's what this breakdown can look like. A forgotten breakdown in the comprehension process, not just of these other areas, is the fact that I don't have a schema for this. I don't know what this is about. It's a poorly elaborated or a missing schema, and the students might be like, that's a nice idea, or that's an interesting fact, but where do I actually put this? So for narrative and nonfiction texts, students are learning things from what they read, but they can't retain it. They can't really learn it unless they already have some background knowledge, because there's nowhere to put it. And there's also no way that they could infer between the lines to make sense of the text. So this is really quite interesting. It's a uncomfortable conversation sometimes, because we might talk about activating background knowledge to help our students understand the text. But as one of my Year 4 students have said to me in the past, what if I've got nothing to activate? And it isn't really just about activating knowledge, it's also about building knowledge. And that's really what we're trying to talk about today, the fact that this is a complex process where knowledge, or the schema that students have, plays an intimate role, not just to help students learn from what they read, but also to help them make sense of what they read, with those dual sort of arrows going there. Now, I just will explain a little bit more as to why I've represented the schema as a wardrobe. Essentially, you can learn this from a non-example of people in our community that don't use wardrobes very well, and that is teenagers or young adults living with their parents or their caregivers. So essentially, if you have a young adult or a teenager at home, they might not have a wardrobe so much as a floordrobe, which means that they don't particularly use their wardrobe very well. This process of not putting the items back where they belong causes a lot of issues, and means that someone eventually has to come in and say, you know what, we have to clear this all out. This is not working. A lot of this stuff is moldy. There's a wet towel in here. There's food and things like that. We need to start again. And essentially all those items have to get washed or taken away. That is what it's like when our students have a knowledge gap. They essentially don't have anywhere to put all those great facts. It goes on the equivalent of the mental floordrobe, and then working memory means we actually have to clear it out. Because if something isn't stored in a schema, it's not stored at all. It's just lost over time. And I hope that wardrobe analogy works well for you, because the schema isn't so much the fact that there's lots of information in there. It's the fact that you also have a way of organizing that information. Oh, I've heard of something like this before. I've got somewhere to put that. It doesn't mean your schema has to be full, but it does have to be well organized, and students have to be aware of where to put things in terms of how to store that information. That's where, when you do activate prior knowledge as well as build prior knowledge, we can help students to adequately understand the context of things. Catherine has said, I shall link this always to a floordrobe, given that she's the mother of 3 young adults. It never used to be young adults, it was always teenagers, but now I think people are living at home for longer. They haven't quite got the hang of the wardrobe yet. It's something about not being in charge of your own house, not doing the cleaning yourself. I don't know. Young adults are still having that problem potentially. So that's the importance of schema. Before I move on, there's a little CFU, if we can. Could you put in one detail or one fact or one helpful piece of advice that you got from this discussion about the situation model? Just a reminder, this model is called the situation model or the tripartite model. And honestly, I think every teacher needs to know this if they're a teacher of reading or a teacher of writing, but it's not often talked about. So if you can write something in the chat, one little piece of information that you want to remember from this discussion, we'll just gather some of those before we move on to the next segment, where we talk about knowledge in a bit more detail. Catherine said, if you don't have existing schema, then you have nowhere to make connections or to store new information. So the floordrobe equivalent of that would be, you are trying to process a new item, but if you haven't got a drawer for it, you have trouble actually figuring out what it is. Imagine there's an obscure piece of clothing that you're not quite sure what to do with it. If you haven't got somewhere to store it or haven't got any other items like it, it's actually hard to justify putting it anywhere. So therefore, you probably just forget it. A few other things have come through. Readers have to ask themselves questions as they read. If you don't have knowledge about something, then you won't be able to build upon it. Activating/building prior knowledge is a really good point. Schema is linked to knowledge and the way to organize new information. No schema equals no inferences. Common sense, but I believe we need to remind ourselves of this as teachers every now and then. Fantastic. So yes, you might think of inferring just as this thing that you have to do, or you have to be reminded about how inferring works. But even if you know how inferring works, you can't read between the lines if you don't know what is written, what is missing. If you don't know how to fill in those gaps, then reading them between the lines or inferring is not a useful strategy. I often say to students that, we need to talk about inferring, but we also need to have the tools in the toolkit to know how to infer in this particular text, because it's all completely text dependent. Yeah. Excellent. So lots of takeaways that people have put there, and thank you for sharing your ideas in the chat as well. It's making me feel like some of these things are really clicking for people. So the next segment, I'm going to relate to non-fiction texts, but this actually still does apply to fiction, and it's because knowledge does underpin all reading. So this section is about building lasting knowledge. Given that I've told you a little bit about the fact that knowledge is important to build, not just activate, and there's therefore an important need to choose non-fiction texts that aren't just random, but that build knowledge cohesively over time and that you can explicitly connect. You can also do this knowledge building process with fictional texts as well. So if you haven't heard of the baseball study before, it is essentially a group of studies that look at the role of background knowledge in reading comprehension. And they basically have shown that poor readers who know more about a particular text can actually understand and remember more than their peers who are actually great readers, but know less about the topic. So just to unpack this a little bit further, in the baseball study, students were broken into two groups. Some had lots of knowledge of baseball, some had no knowledge of baseball. Other students were poor readers, and other students were great readers. And this was on a reading comprehension test. And what they did was see which of those four subgroups performed the best. Obviously, the ones who had high knowledge and high reading ability did the best. The lowest group was those who had low knowledge and low reading ability. The surprising fact was that those poor readers who weren't great at comprehension in general could outperform the great readers when they had more knowledge. So knowledge gave them an advantage, or added as a bit of a compensatory effect to make up for the fact that they weren't as great readers. So if you have a range of readers in your classroom, knowledge is something that you can pull as a lever that helps level the playing field. And if you're missing knowledge, even if you are a great reader, knowledge will get in your way, and it will mean that you don't understand the text as well as some of your peers who do have that knowledge. So this is a pretty powerful group of studies, but it speaks to me as to why we really need to care about background knowledge, not just to form a backdrop, but actually to be front and center. Comprehension strategies are usually what we talk about as being front and center. But ironically, in this day and age, we need to bring the text, the knowledge, the language there to the front of the room. And you may have seen me make this comparison before, and Natalie Wexler talks about this brilliantly in The Knowledge Gap, her book that I think for me helped me understand the value of knowledge really well, more so than just the schema, as being pretty fundamental to understanding text in general. And she connected a lot to E.D. Hirsch's work, who's a researcher and advocate in the US, who's the founder of the Core Knowledge Foundation as well. So this process of saying, you know what, I'm not going to necessarily just plan around comprehension strategies. I'm going to try and actively build knowledge and language skills to help my students learn things. This is where you don't want to just chop and change your texts based on a strategy. You want to choose texts that connect with each other over time, so that you can build up students' background knowledge and schema, which otherwise the students would have to just pick up along the way and not necessarily make all those connections. You can still obviously build comprehension strategies, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but you want to do it in a way that doesn't detract from the content within the text, and certainly doesn't take front and center place that it is there. You want to essentially put it into the background as something that powers or that sits behind all that great comprehension work, because all of those comprehension strategies are helpful. They're just not necessarily going to build the schema that we need students to build if they haven't got that already in their long-term memory. So good readers know things. This is what we've established so far. It's how do you teach knowledge then? Well, it's not just about activating. We actually need to build knowledge. And the metaphor that Natalie Wexler uses is that knowledge is like Velcro. The more that you have, the more that you will be able to stick more facts, more content, more stories, more big ideas into your long-term memory. So imagine that your wardrobes are not just having nice drawers, they also have a whole lot of Velcro on them and can make other things stick to them. So it's almost like magnetized to last in terms of getting that content into students' heads. The amazing thing about this is, although humans sometimes are overwhelmed with the cognitive load of a task, when they see things that are familiar or they can make meaningful connections, they can overcome those limitations of the cognitive load limitations of working memory. This is because humans are searching for meaning constantly. And when they find it, it means that we can harness the power of what's in our schema to make it easier to understand what we're looking at. So in my work in schools, in the consulting that I do with schools, as well as the instructional coaching and curriculum support, I've often supported some of this work to try and make connections between knowledge and the curriculum through materials such as Read to Learn and Write to Learn. And this is a free set of resources, Read to Learn, that's on my charity's website, and Think Forward Educators. And lots of incredible people have contributed to this project over the years, and we nearly have all the history and geography units organized, which is really great, which basically exemplify how you could build knowledge systematically over time and build a series of opportunities to learn key content. This is just a little excerpt from one of these lessons, but shows you how any nonfiction text could be an opportunity to build understanding and build knowledge. And most of these are centered around a big question, such as how are mountains formed? So we'll just watch a little excerpt from this, and I'll show you some of the teaching practices I would do to make this work. Here's the activating prior knowledge part, where they look at a previous lesson, linking it together to what we've learned before. So let me read a little bit for you, and then I'll pretend that I'll do a CFU with you. Not all mountains are the same. Some are extremely high and sharp. Others are short and smoother. This is due to the different ways mountains are made or formed. I get students to read the next bit. We know that the Earth is made up of large areas of land, and they could read this as a choral group. These large areas of land are always moving, and they're actually called tectonic plates, just for your knowledge and to know that it's connected. When these areas or tectonic plates move closer together, sometimes they push up the land in the middle. And this is one way that mountains are made. There are other ways that mountains are made, and today we'll learn about 4 of them. So here we can see an example where 2 plates deep underneath the earth have been pushed together, and it's forced the land to actually create a mountain, which happens very, very slowly, about the length of a fingernail. How fast your fingernails grow each year is how fast mountains grow, but over millions of years can be quite dramatic changes in our landscape, in our geography. Obviously, I'm now embellishing and going a little bit further. If you ever worry that you want to say something, but it's not exactly able to be said at the same time as this without distracting students, you can press W on your PowerPoint and it will make the screen go white, the way that I've done there. That always blows people's minds in a PT when I showed them that. If you want just the screen to turn off, you can press B and it will go black. And this is a really useful one to help you keep the flow of your conversation going, and also to keep things working. You might have also seen that I've been zooming in. So have you been using the fingers on my trackpad, sort of like this, and going like that? You can also go Control and scroll with your mouse if you want to zoom in. But zooming right in close to something is really powerful, and something that you should do when you're wanting to draw students' attention to things. And you can then zoom back out to get the full picture. So the quick CFU I have for students that I would do as a vote yes or no, I'll get you to do, but I don't want you to go, I want you to get your answer ready, but don't press enter until I say go, because otherwise people will just steal each other's answers. So in the chat, draft your response. Do all mountains look identical based upon the text that we've just read? When I say go, I want you to press the Y. I press the enter to let the Y or N come through. So do all mountains look the same? Get your answer ready. And go. Excellent. Someone even did a full sentence answer, including a reason. Thanks, Kim. No, because of the varying materials and nature of their formation. Love it. Excellent. So always check for understanding. And the reason you do that isn't just to practice the skill of finding the main idea or making sense of what you're reading. It's because you're stimulating this building of the mental model. And by reading about important facts and ensuring that they make their way into the student's schema. That's what activating prior knowledge is. It's ensuring that that schema is starting to be activated. Then students are also learning from what they read, as well as reading to learn. And this is really, really powerful. So little example, a little bit more. So at today's goal, I will explain how mountains are formed. For example, we then go into the importance of mountains. And I think later in this lesson, I then talk about the different ways in which mountains are formed. Here I've got some importance of mountains. I'm just zoomed in a little bit to make it a little bit more focused. People have long admired the beauty of mountains. Some people long ago even worshipped them. Now, the word admired, I've got bolded there because it's a vocab word I want to point out. Just talking off the script for a second, you can obviously teach vocab words in advance, and I encourage you to do that. But if you ever come across a word in a piece and you're wondering if students understand it, just explain it. And you can explain it then and there with clear language, or you can put it on the board or refer to where it says in the slide. And here I've got the vocab deliberately on the slide so I can refer to it and make sense of it. People have long admired the beauty of mountains. Admired is a verb, and I'd get the students to read this with me. It means to look at something and be amazed by it. Some people long ago even worshipped them, and worshipped isn't a vocab word there, but I think I would actually tell them what that means. So that means thinking of mountains as a god, and wanting to pay homage to that god, or to show the god respect. They placed offerings on mountain slopes in the hope of good crops, good weather, or good luck that a god might be able to grant. Mountains play a part in many religions. Moses, for example, received the 10 Commandments on the top of a mountain. The ancient Greeks believed their gods lived in the mountains, Mount Olympus, for a little bit of trivia if you wanted to know that. Mountains are important in many ways. They affect Earth's weather and climate. They provide a home for many animals. They contain valuable minerals. And I'd also do this vocab word with students. Minerals are a natural substance found in the Earth's crust in the ground. Sometimes they're precious and sometimes they're pretty banal, or they're pretty everyday. So obviously I could keep going, but then after I go through that content, I would then ask a CFU question. I noticed that I haven't got my example answer ready just here. I actually have it on the next slide. So if I go to the next slide, I can give my example answer, which is always good for helping students stretch. But what I've tried to show you here is that essentially what we're trying to do is schema, building that schema, and also building that background knowledge. But here, when we do read nonfiction texts that are quite rich like this, it allows us to actually go quite deep. So if you ever find yourself trying to teach a comprehension strategy and you are changing the topic every day, one of the smallest changes you can make that make a big difference is by keeping that topic consistent. Reading widely or reading broadly about that topic, but actually making it connect from day to day, or connect from the start of the lesson to the end of the lesson. And this is a really, really great way in which you can ensure that your students are making sense of what they're reading. So that's that model. That's the how knowledge is really important. I'm essentially trying to model how we're moving the comprehension strategy from the front of the class to essentially putting the text, the knowledge, and the language within it at the front, and making that the focus of our attention. But now I want to just give you another introduction to one more kind of practice or strategy, and that is something called questioning the author. And I'm showing you questioning the author because it's a perfect way to stimulate this mental model. And nothing like reading about a topic and hearing about it to then start building this missing schema. And questioning the author is useful for both fiction and non-fiction texts, and intersperse the work so that students are getting lots of opportunity to unpack the text. So shared reading is powerful, especially on texts that are more challenging or tricky, or that have really interesting content or themes within them. And questioning the author, which is looks like this little text here. This is the second edition, 15 Years Smarter, and the authors are Isabel Beck, Margaret McCowan, and Cheryl Sandora. This text is brilliant because it's a very easy and very approachable strategy that you can use to break down any text and make it more possible to stimulate students' working memory and ensure that they have got a really nice mental model of the text as they go. So the approach is to do the following: intersperse reading and intersperse discussion. So reading a little bit with students, one student can read, students can co-read, or the teacher can read, then pausing the reading and putting a bit of discussion in there. Discussion that could start with a pair share and then reporting back, or discussion that could happen just from one student to the next in the class. I have some gestures that I want to share with you, and some people who've looked at my work before know how much I'm talking about gestures all the time. These discussion prompts from Doug Lemov, who's the same author as Reading Reconsidered, are great. I'm going to show those gestures at the end, but let's look at some example questions or queries that question the author talks about. So here in Question the Author, they talk about initiating queries, which are your broad sort of questions that have the following kind of structure. What is the author saying here? What's happening in the story? Or what has just been said, for example? And these initiating queries essentially get students to do the heavy lifting of tell me more about what is happening in the story, tell me more about what's going on. And this is also a useful checkpoint to ensure that students don't plow through a paragraph without asking themselves questions like this. So we're modeling the kinds of things that we want students to do by themselves. Follow-up queries, for example. So how is that different from what we've learned so far? What is the author trying to say here with this particular word? These ones are lovely as well because they press the student to go a bit deeper, and depending on what you're thinking, allow the student to go further with their building of that mental model or that creation of hypotheses of what they think might be going on. So predicting, inferring, thinking and analyzing what might be happening, even if they're not quite sure yet. This is where it does work really well as individuals answering, but then also as a form of discussion. So giving students a chance to share their ideas with others helps them hear lots of different views. Although I would highly recommend, to improve the quality of the discussion, not just doing hands up. So some hands up of students sharing their responses, but also students getting questions without notice or opportunities to share what they talked about with their partner, whether they wanted to put their hand up or not, just so we have a chance for everyone to be thoroughly engaged and have the potential to be called upon, which keeps them on their toes a little bit more. You also have narrative queries as the third category, which asks you to think about what the character is thinking or feeling, as well as what would you do if you were in the character's shoes. And these are just nice ways of getting into those narrative texts and allowing the teacher to facilitate that thinking from the perspective. So just some distracting things in the chat that I'm just going to ignore now. So the Question the Author is great. On this page, I have an excerpt from the first edition, which is from a PDF you can find online with just a few more example queries. And that's a nice reference to come back to if you're interested. The role of the teacher in this is to essentially take any text and insert useful queries. So essentially here we've got an excerpt from this book where it's a short story called The Bridge on the River Clarinet. And this short story is a perfect place for you to experiment and to try out a lesson of questioning the author. And in this lesson, they've actually written it all out for you. So the students would have a copy of the text. So they'd have a copy, just bring that back. They'd have a copy of the paper copy here by itself. The teacher has a copy which has these segments or decisions or comments built in, but the students don't necessarily have access to that because we just want the students to focus on the text, maybe to underline or to add some little notes. But actually, the teacher has access to a few more things. So that we understand a little bit about this approach, I've got about 8 minutes before I want to start the questions, but let me just give you a little demo of this, of just the first part of what's involved, so that you can get a sense of how this approach might work for you and the text that you read with your students. This approach, again, is trying to stimulate the building of that mental model and also that link to the background knowledge of the students and that bringing the content of the text alive rather than just focusing on one comprehension strategy. I think this allows us to do that. So here I would go. The inhabitants of the little town of Framboise-sur-Clarinet were worried. The bridge that spanned, I would use a gesture here, that spanned the river Clarinet was about to collapse. And if the bridge did collapse, the citizens of Framboise would lose touch with the rest of France. So I could stop and pause and explain all of those words, but if I use some gestures and get students to look at me when I get them to say it one more time, gesture with me, lose touch, then it's implied what those words mean. There would be no more trade, no more traffic, and no more tourists. It was therefore necessary to reconstruct the bridge. That means to build it again. But Framboise was poor and the town council was deeply troubled. And what I have next is what the teacher would see to decide what they do. So there's some decisions and comments for the teacher to make. There's two reasons for stopping here. First, the paragraph sets the stage for the town's problem. The bridge is about to collapse and they can't replace it because they don't have enough money. And second, the word inhabitants might be unfamiliar and we might want to ask a question to ensure that they have it. So here, this is what the tendencies of clarinet. We're worried. Who are the inhabitants? And then hearing from a few students, giving them that information if they don't get it. And then here's my formal query. Now, what's going on so far in the story? And seeing what students say, give them to do a quick turn and talk or a pair share if necessary, activate the room a little bit more, and then call upon a few people who have got their hands up or no hands up. And then follow up. How does the phrase lose touch connect with what you just told me? What does that phrase actually mean? And getting them to articulate that it means not being able to cross back and forth, and therefore cutting off things like trade, activity, no more traffic, no more tourists, which would be bad for the economy of this little town. So what I've got for you now is a query of your own, where I want you to reflect on what you might notice about the QTA structure. So question the author is quite different to how other comprehension approaches might work, but this is one that I've said that does allow you to get the focus back on the text and back on the knowledge that you're trying to build within the text. So in the chat, could you respond by saying, what do you notice about the QTA structure, even though you've just seen a little bit of it? And then to adopt this, what might you need? What might you need to do with texts, or what might you need to do in terms of preparing to teach in this way? Some people having a little think. Teachers need to have pre-prepared their queries, prepare questions prior to the lesson, teaching with some more explicit direct instructions so you can show them how this works, give them that background knowledge maybe. Thanks, Ainsley. Source authentic texts that focus on the interest areas of the curriculum. Yeah, connects to more than the text, so plan for your questions. Yep, so it's got a benefit is that it helps you more to be more connected to the text, anticipate possible student questions. Great. Great. So you might want to have some question cards as part of your kit. Now, something to remember is that you could do this approach and this strategy with any text. So we essentially want to choose texts that are worthy of our students' attention, choose texts that build knowledge and understanding, but essentially take any text and do this work with it. We talked a little bit last time about the bridging prose texts that are available at Nelson. I just want to link back to that for just a second. So if you haven't heard of Nova Star, there is a lot of opportunities for you to use this, especially with the just after you do decodables, but before you move on to big novels or big texts. These prose level texts allows you to practice these kinds of things, including this one we looked at last time, where we're reading segments, pausing, asking questions to make sure that students are understanding, and they can be those question the author or QTA style queries, which means they're not as tricky to prepare as, say, I need to turn this into a lesson about summarizing, because although you may do some summarizing, you can also do any other comprehension strategy that is lent to it by the text. You might link to students' background knowledge. You might activate their prior knowledge. You might connect it to their daily life, as well as asking them questions that get them to infer or to make predictions. So these texts at a glance for year levels 3 to 6, but I've actually been using it with one of my my children who's 7 and who's finished with decodables quite a while ago, but needs something else before he can pick up a Roald Dahl or a Enid Blyton or something like that. So it is really useful to have these texts in your toolkit, as well as having them as independent texts that students can practice these kinds of skills. Say if you've given students a chance to have a go of doing these kinds of question the author queries. So if I just get that back up for a second. So these queries, if you teach students to ask and answer these kinds of questions themselves, given that they're not that hard to get their head around, the focus is on how the text is tricky or what's tricky about the text, then it allows you to essentially give them a chance to do this in an independent sort of sense. And ideally, you choose one of these texts that are available that also link to one of your units. So I know there's quite a variety of different topics, fiction and non-fiction, that it can be connected to. And if students have a text like this, for example, they can essentially follow that same process, pause after a paragraph or two, and ask themselves questions. What's happening here? What's the author meaning by this particular word? Am I understanding the text? And that is one of the most underrated comprehension strategies, I have to say, is comprehension monitoring. And questioning the author is a great way to get students to do that. So if you haven't checked that out, that's a really good reason to have a look at this kind of text that might supplement your whole class or individual reading. But essentially, this process could be done on any text, fiction or non-fiction. You just need to ensure the text is just at that sort of level of challenge that is productive, not too challenging if they're doing it independently. And if it is somewhat challenging, doing it with a lot of teacher support, which is how these question the author units are put together. If you want to learn more about Question the Author, there's a podcast episode where the author, one of the authors, Margaret McCowan, one of my heroes, speaks to Ollie Lovell about this approach and actually does an example lesson using Eskimo or Inuit folk tale, which is really quite lovely and profound. And my final message, in case, because sometimes these messages are a little bit misinterpreted, is that although knowledge is powerful and knowledge is incredibly important, and that these general queries are really, really vital, it is still important to try and embed the strategies or some curriculum descriptors into shared reading opportunities as well as shared responding. So say writing a text or a response to a text. So what are the role of comprehension strategies? I'm here to tell you that they're still important, but as we mentioned before, they might not be how you organize your instruction. You might instead plan out your lessons a little bit more on how complicated the text is, what's happening in the text at the moment, and which strategies happen to come up as we talk about them. So we should still teach them explicitly and still give that initial instruction in how the strategy works and the meta language around it, but very quickly actually embed them in these authentic shared reading opportunities, as well as model them when you're doing a read aloud or when you're modeling how to answer a particular question. So saying, I need to predict here, so might have a go at piecing two things together. I think, etc., etc. Checking it makes sense is that comprehension monitoring. So pausing and asking questions is the best way to monitor that. And then summarizing or finding the main idea is incredibly important as well. I haven't got a little reminder here about inferring, mainly because inferring links so closely to background knowledge that it's not even a separate strategy that you want to necessarily have a lesson around. You can show them and explain to them how it works, but the best way to learn how to infer is to have background knowledge you can use to read between the lines. So actually building that knowledge in advance and then getting students to apply that in more challenging reading opportunities is one of the best ways that we can practice inferring. What I'm not saying here is doing lesson after lesson just on the strategy, which may in times gone by might have been the default way to teach comprehension, is a whole week or a whole fortnight or sometimes a whole block on summarizing and choosing the text or changing the text day on day to match that strategy. So instead, I highly recommend embedding that into each and lesson. So lots of comprehension strategies modeled and embedded, as well as choosing quality text that allows you to do that. So here's my little final sort of thought that I want to share with you is that when you teach strategies or key skills from the curriculum, explain how the strategy or skill works, try and model it on an example text and think aloud to show how that strategy works. Move to a rich text worth reading. So don't just practice this on something banal, choose something that is worth the student's time and try and embed this strategy in a shared reading of that text. Then facilitate student use of such strategies in shared and independent reading experiences through doing things like checks for understanding, as well as short tasks that tap into predicting, summarizing, comprehension monitoring, or inferring. There's others as well, like text to self connections and visualizing and so on. These things I think will come up, but probably don't need as much explicit time because this comes up in the course of making sense of the text. The best way to know if you've done a good job of teaching comprehension strategies if students show strategic use of these to make sense of the text and successfully build that mental model, which is what it's all about. So my final key message to wrap all that up is that initially shared reading may be the only time that students are reading extended text. So we want to make sure that those shared reading opportunities are on text that really matter and that we give lots of chances for students to see and to practice those modeled strategies, as well as the building of that mental model. So build habits for reading eventually by moving from shared reading to initially some small bursts of independent reading, because that is so vital to ensure that students are doing these strategies, not just when the teacher's watching, but when they've been asked to do them separately, or when they allow students to show what they know, so to speak. So for that reason, ensure that you have enough rich texts, nonfiction and fiction, for students to practice and to connect knowledge over time. And that if we are trying to build knowledge habits for shared bursts of independent reading as well as shared reading, then texts like the ones that we've started to feature, or this collection of, say, that Nelson offers, as well as many others, could be something that's useful in your toolkit to give students a chance to do that, especially if you've started curating a group of these texts or similar ones that you might already have, and connect them over time with knowledge and content, not just with a particular strategy or a particular level. That's all I wanted to talk about today. And I'll finish on this. I know I've got a lot of key messages. Any text-rich lesson can be enhanced by adding in pause points and queries to model this sense-making process, because all students can build robust mental models, and in that process, build up their schema for what that text is about. And this is where reading becomes not just a process of going through the motions of getting the strategy right, but also, really importantly, learning from what we read and learning about the world through reading, which is a real gift that we want to share with our students. So I want to thank everyone for your attention, and I've got some tiny little announcements of other sort of ways in which you can reach me, but I'd love to do some questions before we do that. I'll put it on this little holding slide if anyone wants to grab some of the questions from the chat for me in the last 5 minutes.
Yes, so just opening the chat now. So if anyone has any more questions, you can pop them in right now, and I'll start reading some of the ones that are already here. So there's one from Charmaine.
Yeah.
So not recommended to do comprehension skills based lesson, but embedded and demonstrate a focus comprehension strategy instead. So it's kind of referring to your half of
So
it.
I think it's a clarifying question that Charmaine's asking. I would say back to this one, you can still do an explicit lesson, but after you've done that initial instruction, you don't need to do lesson after lesson after lesson on that strategy. Instead, try and get the focus back on the text and using that strategy. So that's the idea of, we know how to summarize. I've talked to you about it. Now I'm going to model it. And then I want you to notice how I'm using it, and then get you to practice it by asking the right questions, by giving them the right sort of writing tasks, as well as getting them to practice it in a text that is really meaningful, rather than everyone go and practice summarizing on any random old text. Ideally, they choose a text that is connected, or that has been built upon in many different lessons over time. So either the same fictional text, or a curated list of books or short passages, for example, or short stories that do connect in some way to that knowledge building, mainly because you then get bang for your buck. You've got an opportunity to build up student schema, as well as an authentic and guided way of practicing a particular strategy. We just don't need to potentially do flogging of summarizing for weeks on end. And that is a shift for some schools, because that might be how they've basically planned, is all around the strategies.
I don't think if there's any more time, people please do feel free to add questions. But Nathaniel, there's really comments. I mean, most of them are so positive, but also that there's a comment, I think I'm just going to scroll back up, that I thought was really interesting around, you've just got to, it's not just, as you're saying, through shared reading, but that right across the curriculum, if you can, and through your planning, like, that way you can start building and then activating knowledge.
Yeah, so Elizabeth has got a nice one saying, building knowledge isn't just about instruction and supporting reading comprehension. We need excellent topic content, immersive learning. For example, learn about mountains and tectonic plates for a full week or more, not just through a little bit of shared reading, but across the curriculum. And I think that's really nice. So showing how that what you read could then be built upon in what you write, but also then what you might do hands-on activities about as well. And I think that's really important, that the reading is like a launching pad as well as an anchor to return to, and that it does connect across the curriculum. And I've got this little slide that builds upon that, which I had ready, if I can find it. This is where, once you've selected your text, you've got to ask yourself, what do you want to get students to do to interact with it. If it's a complex text, you're not just going to read it once. You're actually going to read it, listen to it, so read aloud, discuss it, unpack it, respond to it in your writing, but also verbally, question or critique it, as well as build upon it. So say we have been reading about this. Now we're going to go into a slightly related or different text or a different version of this, or an audio-visual sort of version, or a video, for example, ways of getting students to have multiple chances to do interesting things with the text in front of them. So I think Elizabeth's connection there is really powerful.
There's another one here. So are you using this in whole class teaching? Do you have any tips for big difference in reading ability within a class?
Yep. So yes, it is whole class teaching. You can obviously do this on a smaller scale as well with follow-up groups, but to get the full benefit of students having that chance to engage in rich text together, it is really worth having the students all together at once. You can obviously activate different groups and help them to have accountable sort of opportunities to respond by doing lots of whiteboard and pair share tasks and reporting back to the group. But the benefit of the whole class discussion is that we're actually reading it aloud. So your students don't need to have independently decoded it or to have understood it, because the teacher's actually modeling how to do that. When you break off into some independent reading or a follow-up activity, that's when you could have a slightly different version of the follow-up task or follow-up text, or read that same text again, where some have a slightly simplified version or have an excerpt, whereas others have the longer version or the full text. And I think that's really important, because we're probably used to doing these as rotations or as guided reading groups. What I would say is that if you want to do a guided reading group, just do a nice big whole class discussion on a text first to give everyone a chance to meaningfully engage and get access to that rich content. And then your guided reading should follow up on that or build upon it, rather than this is your only chance to engage in the text, and some kids get high and some kids get low text, because I do feel like that creates a lot of inequity in the classroom. Yeah, and Elizabeth has connected to that as well. There might be one more question if we've got time. I know we've just clicked over.
I think let's go to one where we're like thinking of that whole group and that whole class response and that shared reading with these oral responses. But there's a good question here, I think, from Paula around, well, how do we get that same robustness of answer in its written form?
Same robust answer in a written form, e.g. comprehension assessment. So I would say you actually can build in quite a lot of writing in these sessions. So the use of mini whiteboards is powerful. They also, the use of having a booklet. So say you've got a text that you're unpacking together. If you have a booklet that sort of has a series of tasks that relate to what you're reading, so you've planned it all out beforehand. Some of the OCA and some of the Victorian lesson plans, for example, might have this support for you to use. Essentially, you should be encouraged not just to verbally respond, but to intersperse those verbal with the written responses. Or a really nice combination is that you get students to write their response first to really try and get the answer right themselves, then share with a partner, and then discuss and revise what they've written as well. So I would say you need to build in lots of writing, but when you're first unpacking something, it's good to get them talking about it, because it does level the playing fields a little bit. You might also have some adjustments, saying some students will write quite a bit, other students might write a shorter response based on what their writing ability is, but the robustness of the ideas can be just as rigorous for everyone.
Well, I think that's probably where we'll end it, given it's just ticked over 5. But we just want to thank you, Nathaniel, for today's amazing session. Like, I have learned so much from today's session, and I'm definitely thinking about my wardrobe up here, but also
and many wardrobes, in fact. Yeah, so millions of them.
Plenty of wardrobes. So yeah.
If it's okay, I will just mention a place that you can go to see examples of practice. Chalk Dust is the podcast I do with Rebecca Birch, where we need to have more English and humanities lessons featured soon, but we've done a bit of maths and things recently. But there are some really high quality video examples that we unpack, and common pieces that I'm watching later this year, maybe early next year, depending on how I can get my act together, which I'm excited to say is bite-sized pieces of these kinds of PD topics that you could unpack 1 5-minute video at a time with your colleagues or with your staff. And that's the easiest way that you can hear about that platform earliest. And if you just want to get in contact with me, this little overview slide slide just gives you a link to my website, and you can see there's my blog there, the Cognitorium, where I often write about these topics as well. Thank you again, Kate and the team. Thanks, Nelson, for hosting these fabulous webinars. And thank you, everyone, for joining, even on a very busy week. I see there's 24 new messages, which I'm guessing are lots and lots of thank yous. And I want to thank you for your active participation. And any last words from the Nelson team?
No, that will, for all the attendees to this session, we'll be sending out the recordings on Friday. And then for those who are watching later, you will have received an email, of course, and will now be watching. But thank you so much. It's just been fantastic. And thanks to the audience and participation. I love it.
There is also this little webinar here that we mentioned, but you might not have noticed. We did this last week, Why Prose Reading Matters More Than Ever. And that I've noticed is available on YouTube already, which is fantastic. So do have a look at that. It's sort of the two together, I think, do complement each other a little bit. And I really enjoyed that discussion last week as well. So thank you for the opportunity to do two, like a double whammy.
Thank you, everybody. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you, guys. I'm trying to find my cursor to end this. Have a lovely evening, everyone.